Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third devotion for this week, based around our passage that we looked at on Sunday, James 1:12 to 25. Today, I thought we could do something a little bit different. This passage is all about temptations, how trials become temptations. Remember, we noticed that the word for trial in James 1, verse 2 and verse 12 is the same word for temptation in James 1 and verse 13. And it's significant because there is no doubt that God sometimes tests us with challenges and difficulties to make our faith mature, and we are to consider them joy. But he is not responsible for temptations. He's not responsible for sin. And so when a trial becomes a temptation and we fall into sin, we can't blame anyone for that other than ourselves. And so I think it's helpful to think a little bit about how trials can become temptations, and particularly at the moment, because it is significant, isn't it, that we're all going through this really unpleasant trial of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown that's been imposed to try and reduce the impact of the pandemic, but has had negative effects on all of us to some degree or another. And so I thought it would be good to just think of a few ways in which this pandemic and the lockdown and what happens as a result of that could become a temptation for us and could lead us into sin. And there are a couple of things that I've thought of, and these are just ideas I've thought of. You might think of others and consider maybe how we can become more godly as a result of using this pandemic as a test that makes us mature rather than a temptation that leads us into sin. And so the first thought that I had is that it's very easy for us to develop a spirit of rebellion because we don't like the way the government is handling this pandemic. And I think South Africans are pretty notorious for this. We're quite a rebellious lot. We like our freedom. We don't like people to tell us what to do. And we particularly don't like our freedoms to be curbed. And this pandemic and the lockdown that has resulted has indeed taken some of our freedoms away, and some of them have affected us quite badly. And so it's very easy to disparage the government and to even rebel and just plain not do what they tell us to do if it doesn't suit us or if we don't agree with it. But I think it's important to remember that rebellion is sin. And we are commanded to obey our government, to submit to them, and to do as they say. And if they're not telling us to not believe in God or not to witness for Jesus, we should do what they say, and they're not telling us we can't do that. And so let's beware of a rebellious spirit that willfully disobeys, because that's temptation that leads us into sin. And then secondly, I think and this is maybe the opposite reaction, but is just as a dangerous one, is to have a spirit of fear amongst ourselves. So this virus is dangerous. There's no doubt about that. Many people have become infected with it, and others have died. And while the death rates in South Africa are less than maybe other countries, it is still tragic that people have contracted this virus, which is so easy to contract, and that it's killed them. And so some people have become really fearful of it, and they have really locked themselves in and not got involved with anybody and just become terrified of being involved in everyday life. And I think that is equally dangerous, because the Bible talks about the fact that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of self-discipline. And so we need to be disciplined and not go out where we don't need to. We need to recognize that self-control is an important part of the way a Christian lives. But we don't need to be afraid that this thing is going to do unlimited damage to us. Whatever damage it does do, God is in control. Whatever harm comes upon your life, God will look after you. He promised that he would. And even if it does its worst and kills you, well, the Bible speaks about the fact that for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And the Christian person should never, ever forget that death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. In fact, it opens us into the presence of God like never before. And so, while we need to be respectful that this virus is dangerous, while we need to take precautions because we certainly don't want our lifestyles to impact and affect other people, we mustn't be afraid because God is with us. And when He is with us, we are safe, whatever might happen to us. And so those are a few thoughts that I've had. Maybe you've had some other thoughts, and you might want to share them with us. Let's not give in to temptation while we go through the trial of the COVID-19 pandemic. God bless you. See you next week.